CEO of the Security Industry Authority in the UK. To Mr. Clamp's immediate left would be the National Security Minister, Major General retired Edmund Dillon, who's going to rejoin us shortly. To Mr. Dillon's left, the Chairman of the Joint Select Committee on National Security, Mr. Fitzgerald Hines. To Mr. Hines' left will be the Clerk of the House, Ms. Jackie Sampson-Miguel, who's going to rejoin us shortly as well. To Mrs. Sampson-Miguel's left would be the Vice Chairman of the JSC on National Security, Mr. Prakash Ramadar. And to Mr. Ramadar's left, a member of the JSC on National Security, Senator Paul Richards. So we'll take the first question now, please, or thought or comment. Gentlemen.
A pleasant good day to everyone. My name is Holly Prescott. I'm the former Public Relations Officer of the Estate Police Association. Now, very briefly, because I know we have a very short time for everyone to make their comments. When we look at legislation with regards to private security, I'm hearing all of this, but do we legislate behavior? When we look at the terms and conditions that security personnel have to work through, and we heard about the gender disparity, with where you have now more females working inside of the private security who are seen about the children. When an officer has to work 12 hours on a regular basis, who is seen about the children when the gang leaders have to tell the boy, take this bag, carry it up the road. And we are seeing the surge in crime because at the end of the day, these officers, while protecting persons, property, and so on, who are protecting the people that they are responsible for. That is one aspect. So we do not legislate behavior. We have to look at the terms and conditions and look at how the security officer fits in the national fabric of the society and how we protect family life, time to worship, time to deal with personal advancement and so on. Now, when we look at the amendment to the Supplemental Police Act, in which there was, and I think Honorable Mr. Ramadar can view some light on it since that came up under the past administration, and maybe the Honorable Minister, Mr. Hines, can tell us. There was a proposal to take away 9,000 precepts from private security and remove the superintendents of the security person and give them a license. But we're speaking about fighting crime. And at the same time, there was something on board to precept 500 soldiers. Now, I'm not a mathematician. I'm just merely a security guard. But how can 500 soldiers be precepted and take away 9,000 precepts from private security make any sense? Is that still on the table? And what was the rationale behind that? So even going forward, how do we as a nation look at really dealing with legislating this whole thing to make sense? Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me respond to that very, very briefly. I have listened to your concerns and we'll take note of them, but what is on the table today is the question of the regulation of the industry as it now exists and what we can do in order to improve it along the lines of or based on the comments made by Mr. Clamp. So we will certainly take note of the comments that you have made, but that is not immediately on the table before us. Folks, please, okay. You're very welcome.
Good day to everyone. My name is Sean Dalip Singh. I am the CEO of Security Enhancements and Technologies Limited. And for all of you who don't know me, I don't know if recently, February, you heard someone who went and did free hugs in the country. Right? Free hugs, yeah, that's me. Right? I am the criminal deportee / whatever they call me. Anyways, Mr. Clamp, what are your thoughts on facial recognition? I have, for the last year, been trying to get the P&M government to adopt facial recognition into surveillance throughout the airports, the ports, and I was trying to put some cameras in Citygate. Could you tell me what do you think about facial recognition?
Could you?
No, facial recognition as part of private security. Because if you know, most of the companies that offer facial recognition is private, military, and security companies.
Okay.
Okay. Well, in the UK, the tools available for facial recognition... Sorry. Within the UK, the tools available for facial recognition are still very much in development. There are some quite sophisticated methods now. Those who it is available to are very limited at the moment. It's the security services, the intelligence services, and the police. There are no examples of private security firms themselves currently using facial recognition as part of their work in public protection. I suspect there are potentially some issues, some of them might be legal, around that information and data sharing. As a government agency, as I mentioned, actually we can have access to facial recognition when we're trying to identify individuals and verify who they are. I think, therefore, it's more about the protocols of getting access to that and how it would be used, which would probably be a policy decision for the government. And I think underpinning that would be trust in the organisation that it would keep that information safe, it would use it appropriately, and so on. But at the moment, in the UK, there's no private security use of facial recognition.
And what are your thoughts about private security and cybercrime? Again,
it's probably the fastest growing crime, well, in the world, definitely in the UK. We're told that we're much more likely to be a victim of cybercrime than we are any other crime. I think I've probably come closest to people trying to take things from me individually and personally via cybercrime than any other way, and therefore definitely it is a problem. Once again, I think with the exception of what you might call in-house security, and I think typically of things like banks and so on who are dealing with personal details, who will have their own cybercrime experts, it's not currently a big market in the UK. Because it's so tightly controlled, it generally tends to be in-house. So it may be a big market, but it's not regulated. But it is also part of our act that could be enacted. So I think all I'd say at the moment is there's not a lot of work in the private sector for that contracted private security, but it will be a growth area in the future. But I think that the same issues still exist around trust, access, storage to information and sharing it with others. So you're probably in the same sort of policy space.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Next. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. My name is Nicholas Nigel Noriega, and I'm from Cygate Security Agency Limited. I just want to inquire, especially in the UK, is there a minimum educational requirement for anyone who desires to enter into the security industry?
No minimum educational requirement at all. Quite a lot of security officers operating in the lowest level job have minimal education qualifications. The two things that they need are to have a good quality of in particular spoken English, and they need to pass the relevant security qualification. And in fact, it's very difficult to pass the security qualification without having a good command of English. But there are no other requirements other than to have what is called a license-linked qualification, because unless you can prove you've got that qualification, you can't get the license, but nothing else.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Someone else?
I have a question.
Okay.
Well, after I'll defer to the gentleman first.
Mr. Richards, and then we'll take the gentleman. Go ahead.
This is for Mr. Clamp. When the Act became law in the UK 15 years ago, one would imagine that private security companies would have had to go through quite a bit of restructuring. What sort of mechanism was put in place to allow for that so that you didn't have a shutdown of the input of private security in the UK one? And how did the UK deal with the issue of contracts that would have already been awarded by the state, as is the case in Trinidad and Tobago, in terms of giving those companies a chance to reevaluate the operations and transition? And secondly, the issue of possibilities, if there's a ratio of sizes of security companies when compared to the size of the local law enforcement in terms of having that parity, and precepted officers as a ratio of law enforcement officers precepted.
Well, the Private Security Industry Act was passed in 2001, and although I mentioned that we started regulating in 2003, 2004, I think first of all that will give you an idea about how long the industry has to start to prepare to get ready. The primary function of a much smaller security industry authority at that time was essentially to travel around the country doing events such as this to inform people about what was coming. When we did start to regulate, we rolled out regulation gradually in two ways. We did it sector by sector. So, for example, security guards could be first, then door supervisors and so on, and that was on a risk basis. And also we did it regionally. So it was rolled out in parts of England before it went to Scotland, before it went to Northern Ireland and so on. I think it's very important that if you introduce regulation, you invest in explaining why these are the regulations, why these are the rules. You explain how to comply. You give people a reasonable amount of time to get to a level of compliance before you start actually enforcing it. So I think it's a very practical way of doing it, and also because I've rolled out other regulation, the first time you do anything, the most important thing is to engage with the people who are delivering it so that it can be delivered successfully. In terms of the numbers of private security officers in comparison with the police, there's 3 times as many private security individuals in the UK as there are police. In certain particularly built-up areas, the ratio gets much higher than that. I mentioned, talking at the break earlier, that if you go down Oxford Street in central London, right now, as we speak, you could possibly have 10 police officers covering that whole area. At the same time, you'll have 1,000 private security guards in the premises there. And that is not an unusual ratio in terms of their areas. I think the one thing that we've not yet done that I'd like to develop is to actually have more what you might call precepted officers, because we have a basic entry qualification at the security guards, a lot of them just stick at, and there's quite a gap in the training between that and the kind of training the police do. And I think the police themselves have lower entry levels, such as specials and community support officers, but they're relatively few in number. And I think if there was a career pathway from a basic entry qualification for security to working more with the police and ultimately possibly becoming part of the police force, that would help professionalize private security. And also, one of the challenges we face is that around 50% of people do not renew their license. They only work for a certain period because the pay is not great and so on. Whereas if there was a developmental, a professional route, they may stay, and certainly the better ones would stay. So I think that is certainly something we've been talking about in the UK, probably only over the last couple of months, but is an area we'd like to develop.
From the SIS perspective, was there any concern after the operation started about the size of individual security companies or limitations or considerations, limitations of that, when one can consider that theoretically a security firm can become larger than the state police force and hold more preceptive officers than the state police force?
Well, without naming them, I think you could probably either guess or quickly look up the sort of top 10 security companies, all of which have an international basis, some of which I know are represented in Trinidad and Tobago. On their own, would any of those actually be getting up to the level of a police force No, but in fact, the other thing that we do see is a lot of diversification of private security businesses, so they're not just operating in that space. They also do facilities management, they look after immigration centres, they run private prisons, they transport prisoners, and so on. But we haven't actually had any particular challenge around the size of one security company essentially almost sort of swamping the police, despite that 3-to-1 ratio around the country.
One here, and we have another question to follow after him.
Yes, good day to the members of the head table, and I want to thank you all for inviting us here to be part of this symposium, that we could share some ideas and so on. I have several questions. First of all, I'd like to address my first question to...
Could you give us your name and what body you represent?
My name is Peter Soon, and I am the Chief Security Officer of Alpha Protective Services.
Okay.
Right. My first question to Mr. Clamp is, now the SIA licensed the security officers in the UK, but are these security officers also bonded in terms of a cash bond or some other recognizance, so that in the event of any negligence on their part, that their employer can now rely upon that bond? And secondly, and this question will most likely be directed to the Honorable Mr. Dillon. If an authority, a similar authority is being established in Trinidad and Tobago, would this authority also be solely funded by fees from the security companies and the licenses that are being paid for by security companies, or are they also going to be subsidized by the government? And what is with respect to the issue of immigrants, because Mr. Clamp spoke about foreigners, I think, being members of, being security guards licensed in the UK. And the representative from OLEP indicated in his presentation that the disparity between males and females in Trinidad and Tobago being security officers is very wide, with more females employed in the industry than males, and also the presence of undocumented immigrants being part of the security industry here and being hired by security companies. So is the government, what is the intention with respect to that? Because the industry has a problem with manpower. Is the government going to open the security industry to CARICOM nationals, as they do with the CSME, where other professionals and other workers can come into Trinidad and work? Is the CSME going to be extended to include nationals from our neighboring countries to alleviate these problems? That is all questions that I have at this time. Thank you.
Okay. So we'll have Mr. Clamp take the first question.
To answer your first question, individual security operatives are not bonded in any way. They essentially have shown their competence to do the role through getting the badge in the first place, and individual liability is therefore very limited. Having said that, if those operatives work for one of our approved contractors on the voluntary scheme, then there are sanctions in there for us to take against the business. And it's the business, therefore, that takes that liability, has that insurance, and so on. I think the question about fees is definitely not one for me, but I will just mention, going back to the point about immigration and right to work, we do have a Home Office immigration enforcement
organisation who is regularly checking the status of people, but it is a challenge that the industry itself does face at the moment in the UK at peak times, particularly during the summer when there's a lot of additional events on, crowded spaces, a lot of buyers are looking for extra security in the wake of terrorism attacks, and there can be strains on the workforce at times, which encourages people sometimes to bend the rules a little bit, to get a few more bodies in place who perhaps haven't got the licenses, and we need to be particularly vigilant there. But one of the challenges that will happen, I suspect, is Brexit, where EU nationals can no longer just come into the UK to work in 2 years' time. It's already starting to happen now. Probably less than 10% of the workforce come from EU countries, but 10% is still 20, 30,000 people, and the industry's only really got a couple of years to address that. So it is a challenge in the UK as well.
Thank you for those questions. Let me answer the first one with respect to looking at the model that was presented to us with respect to the collection of fees and so on. I think we can take something from that. Again, one of the reasons why we're here is to look at contributions and look at practices elsewhere. While this is not on the table right now in terms of consideration, but when I looked at the presentation, it jumped out at me. That is something that we certainly can look at, something that we can consider. And definitely, when we look at subsidies right now, government, given the economic situation that we're in, would look as much as possible to cut back on subsidizing. So we will look at that model. I believe it's something that we can utilize in terms of our consideration going forward. The other question with respect to the use of illegal immigrants and so on, it is still the law in Trinidad and Tobago, and like anywhere else, all the other CARICOM countries and throughout in the international domain, that one requires a certain level of either a work permit or other sort of documents to be employed in Trinidad and Tobago. And therefore that will be encouraged at all costs. You also raised the issue in terms of comparing what is the list of people who are entitled under the CSME program. Now that is a decision that has to be taken by CARICOM and not by one country, in particular Trinidad and Tobago. So that must be tabled at the level of CARICOM for some kind of decision. And maybe if you as a body feel that that is important, then you should present some kind of position paper to CARICOM that can include them as a list of concern. You have, if you bring your association thoughts together, if the private and security industries feel that there's something that is required, given your research, given your ideas of what pertains in the industry, then I suggest that you develop a proposal that you can use to lobby CARICOM to bring that one. But at this point in time, we go with what has been decided, what has been determined under the CSME, which is again, as I mentioned, not just Trinidad and Tobago's position, but a CARICOM position into the lists of personnel and qualifications that are entitled on the CSME program to work in Trinidad and Tobago without a work permit.
Okay. We have a question from Mr. Ramadan, and then we'll take the gentleman in the purple polo.
Thank you very much. Mr. Clamp, could you help us a little bit about the provision of firearms to private citizens in the United Kingdom, and equally or more so in relation to private security personnel and firms?
Well, firearms are difficult to describe it in exact terms because you can never be sure, particularly in terms of the black market, but are relative to many countries in the world, relatively rare in the UK. The police, certainly up until around 15 years ago, very rarely carried any weapons. There is now a bigger armed police response function within the UK, but again, it tends to be specialised in the major cities with a lot of additional training and so on, very limited. There are no private security operatives who carry any form of weapon in the UK.
Yeah. Okay, gentleman in the purple polo, and then we will take you and then you.
Hi, morning. Morning to the head table. I am Steve Smart, President of the association, Estate Police Association. The association would like to say that we have not received a copy of the bill. We looked online, and we are saying to have a proper discussion or dialogue, we need to have or we should have been issued with a copy of that document. But be that it may, the association, one question to Mr. Clamp. Sorry. Mr. Clamp, we deal with representation in Trinidad, the association, for estate constables. An estate constable is someone who has been precepted by the police commissioner. So the commissioner has superintendence over these officers. The IRA in Trinidad and Tobago specifically states that we are not workers. So we are in a special category already. There's an act to deal with that, the Industrial Relations Act 1972. Our Supplemental Police Act is tied to the IRA under Part 4 and 5 that deals with disputes and purposes of negotiations. Question: in your environment, are these officers part of any association? And how do they get representation when issues arise? One, and that regulatory body, is it in close dialogue with the police, or just that the agency has superintendents, or the police have superintendents? Which organization has superintendents here? To the Minister of National Security. Mr. Minister, we would have had, the association would have started discussions with Mr. Gary Griffith in 2015, January. And we were expecting those discussions to continue. Reason being that there's already a framework for officers to be dealt with. I heard the member for OLEP said that there is so much conflict, but the Supplemental Police Act has laid out a procedure for dealing with conflict. Ministry of Labor, Industrial Court, that kind of thing. Would the police commissioner, question, still have the superintendent over the constables? Because we are not hearing anything about estate constables in this discussion. And we would like to know the position of the government in this matter, because we also represent in-house. And the in-house are also precepted officers. We represent approximately 40 private companies, and they have precepted officers. Now, third question. We have agreements with these companies. What is going to happen to those agreements? Thanks.
Mr. Clamp, thank you very kindly. Before Mr. Clamp makes his response to your question, let me say that the 2014 bill to which we referred earlier was laid in the Parliament, is by that means a very public document, and was available even then on the parliamentary website. If you wish that we would provide you with a hard copy, that can quite easily be done.
We would appreciate that, sir.
But I want you to understand it has been long available to you. Let me pass over to Mr. Clamp for his response to your question. Thanks.
Thank you for your question. As I mentioned before, in-house security directly employed by any organisation is not currently regulated in the UK because it's considered lower risk. But of those that are contracted to provide security provision, one of the challenges we face is we talk about the private security industry, but it's not a single industry. It's some very big firms, some international firms, and some very small ones. Also, they specialise in different areas of the market, and again, as I've mentioned, some of those have diversified into facilities management and so on. So the problem we have when we want to talk to the industry is that we need a room almost as big as this to talk to all the representatives. There are some sector bodies. There is the British Security Industry Association, which represents a number of the bigger firms. There are other associations which represent smaller ones. There are yet other ones who specialize in high-tech type security. Furthermore, those people who work with the police as specials or community support officers will be represented by the Police Federation. So it is very piecemeal, it is difficult. One of the positive moves that's happened in the UK in the last year is that a new organisation has started called the Security Commonwealth. It has about 47 members, but each of those members represents a membership organisation. So potentially you've got thousands and thousands of people represented. That meets quarterly, we're invited, and it's a good opportunity to speak to everybody we need to. But it is a challenge, but as I say, this is only for contracted security, and it's the fact that it's such a diverse field that it's difficult and quite understandable that it can't speak with one voice.
Okay.
Thank you very much again for your questions. You started off by mentioning that the discussion started somewhere around 2013. But again, let me remind you that the whole discussion of the private security industry regulation started off way in 1995. And I can tell you from my own personal experience, in 2009 and 2010, I was then the Chief of Defense Staff under the Ministry of National Security. Again, that was brought to the table, where there was a feeling that there must be some kind of regulations because of the contributions that could be made by the private security industry. So that 2009 and 2010, again, it emerged as part of our discussions. The fact is that we are at the juncture now where both the bills for the private security industry was laid in 2014. The regulation was also laid in 2014. The bill for the supplemental police was also laid in 2014, and the regulation, they were all laid in 2014. The government at this juncture is in fact reviewing both the policy and the effects of the bill, understanding that we are in a dynamic environment, and therefore there must be a review at this point in time, which is at the Attorney General, looking at the policy and looking at both the regulations and the bill to bring it again back into the Parliament. So we are at that juncture at the point in time. My cabinet colleagues here mentioned that it is available, and in fact I was about to mention that all of those bills are available on the website and will be made available to you. With respect to your question concerning the Commissioner of Police continuing control or oversight over the officers, it is something that will be considered and is still being considered, because there must be some kind of oversight. There must be a nexus, a relationship between the private security industry and the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service. And therefore that relationship has to and must start at the highest level. And therefore there must be some kind of oversight, some reporting body to have the Commissioner of Police involved in what happens in the private security industry. So I do not see that, even as I stand and even as the AG is reviewing it, I do not see that being taken away. Because if, as we go forward, we're looking at a philosophy of cooperation and collaboration in bringing the units to contribute effectively to deal with crime and criminality, there must be that kind of relationship and some kind of oversight between the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service and the private security industry.
Sir, the website, we have scored that website, so I don't know if you all could give us something, because we have not gotten it on the website.
We'll share that with you.
Okay.
And by way of further information, I can confirm it was that very bill was first laid in 2001 and was relayed in 2014. But thank you very much. We'll make a copy available.
Thank you very much. Before we take our next question, I would just like to remind those viewing at home on the Parliament Channel 11 or Parliament Radio 105.5 FM or via our YouTube channel ParlView that you could send your questions to parl101@ttparliament.org, or on the chat, the YouTube chat, you could send your questions via the YouTube chat on our YouTube channel ParlView as well. Next question.
Good day, everyone. My name is Richard Rupnarain. I'm the Education and Research Officer of the Estate Police Association. With respect to the private security bill, I agree that there is need to regulate the certification and decertification of companies, and the bill should include fines that establishes suitable deterrent to bad practices. there, in my view, a need for a multi-tiered structure to regulate the award of contracts between companies as well. The bill should include a section to make it mandatory for security companies to observe laws which are not usually automatically applied to precepted officers, such as the Workmen Compensation Act and the Minimum Wages Act. A lot of our labor problems comes from the fact that we're a special category of employee, and that needs to change. And I'm suggesting that estate police officers be equated to workers within the meaning of the Industrial Relations Act, so that they could enjoy the protections and privileges of those employees as well. There is need for the Act to state specifically the obligations between the state, employer, and employee to each other. In the event of a national state of emergency, what is the requirement? Where is the chain of command? Expenditure, who's going to cover that? If the officer passes away, God forbids, what is their level of compensation, and who addresses that? And that has to be outlined, because the precepted officers in this country may very well be called upon to enforce law and order in such a crisis. In my view, there's need for a statutory board to be established to enforce licensing arrangements that would be in the bill, to set industry standardized labor code. The only thing we have approaching that right now is the Private Security Industries Order in the Minimum Wages Act itself, which is woefully inadequate. We need in the statutory board to set training and development standards throughout the industry, and to set standards with respect to PPE. There's no standard with respect to the acquisition of body armor in Trinidad and Tobago, and this needs to be regulated, because I'm aware that there are certain persons selling fake body armor. We need to standardize weapons in use. That was touched on earlier, but I'd like to say that crime in Trinidad and Tobago has evolved to such an extent where criminals possess high-powered automatic weapons. We see them seized by the government police almost on a daily basis on the newspapers. The 5.56 and 7.62 ammunition will penetrate the soft type 3A body armor that most security officers wear. And if officers are to execute their duty in this country in these modern times, then we need suitable PPE as well. I'm suggesting that suitable unemployed nationals are referred to certified companies. This will lead to a reduction in government spending on unemployed relief schemes and address labor shortages in the country. The Estate Police Association at present is authorized under Section 39 of the Supplemental Police Act as the sole body to represent precepted officers in this country at this point in time. We would like to see that arrangement continue in any new proposed bill or amendments. We are the established body. We provide representation. We have been doing so for quite some time. In fact, the Estate Police Association from 1950 to 2004 represented watchmen and security officers. It was due to a judgment of the Industrial Court in 2004 that the EPA no longer could represent security officers. It's due to the terms and conditions negotiated by the Estate Police Association for its precepted members that security officers largely benefit in companies, because the same conditions and similar wages would apply to these officers as well, because they would be deemed to be workers in a lower category of employment. With respect to the increase of females in the industry, my view is that it is due to the high cost of living in Trinidad and Tobago, and little or no fitness requirements and little or no training requirements by companies. So obviously people will have to have a source of income to supplement themselves, and the industry provides that. With respect to the presentation by Mr. Clamp, which on the section of licensing on specific sectors, I would suggest if we are to adopt something similar, that we have a certification for RRU type training. In this country, we have a lot of companies with tactical units to respond to various instances. That may not be the practice in the UK, but we have that here. So if we are to enter into that type of legislation, perhaps that could be pursued. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Well, I would say thank you very much for those insightful points, and they are all recorded and will be taken into account in any new policy and positions the bill will reflect going forward. Yes, anyone else?
The gentleman in the
Yes, please.
Burgundy
You're
College
closer
here.
to the mic, and then your
Go ahead.
colleague. And then you can go in right behind him. Come on. Thank you.
Good afternoon, members of the panel. Welcome to Trinidad and Tobago, Mr. Clum. I am Sinclair O'Neill, the Divisional Manager of Security at the National Maintenance Training and Security Company Limited. We are a state enterprise, and the security division is the largest component of the organization. Overtime is a reality in the industry. And as a state enterprise, we are duty-bound to abide by the labor laws and our collective agreement where overtime is concerned. Unfortunately, this is not the reality that we face when competing for contracts with the other organizations that exist in the industry. To Mr. Clum, I want to ask you, how have you all treated with similar indiscretions in formulating your regulations? And to the chairman of the committee, Mr. Hines, what provisions, what mechanisms you all are putting in place to treat with such indiscretions? Thank you.
Thank you. As I mentioned, the UK is the only country in the European Union that doesn't regulate directly businesses. We only have a voluntary approved scheme. The practices that you allude to, which essentially potentially is being out-competed or undercut by lower quality security provision, couldn't happen if that voluntary scheme were mandatory, because that would be a high enough standard. What we can do if somebody's in the scheme and behaving that way is take them out of it. Otherwise, we have no other formal sanctions other than perhaps to make people aware that to buy security from that particular company is posing a risk. That is one option. But actually what we tend to do is to work with other organizations who may have an interest in those companies. If I give you an example, typically in the UK, if a security company turns up and says, I can provide you guards at a rate of £9 per hour, then when you take into account their tax and national insurance implications and the overheads of the company, they cannot be paying the minimum wage. And therefore, as soon as they do that, the ears pick up of HMRC, and we will alert them with that information. We have an information sharing agreement. We tell them everything that we know, and generally they will go and try to address the issue. So where we can, we exert influence, and where we can't, we share the information with partners to try to do that. But it's still an ongoing issue in the UK, which is the unregulated part of the market, the black market, if you want, undercutting the established and approved market. And the one other thing that we need to do better as well is to inform buyers. So, for example, in certain areas of the country, what we've done now is going to anybody who does any significant procurement or buying of security and giving them some advice and say, here's 10 questions to ask. If the companies can't answer all of these correctly and show you evidence, then we would suggest, but we can't direct, that you don't use them.
Yeah.
Again, let me thank you for your question. I think when we look at the situation as you describe it with respect to the statutory bodies like MTS and so on, compared to the other actors in the private security industry. The only procedure, I believe, the only methodology we can use is to level the playing field, and the only how we can do that is by regulations to a large extent, so that all are subjected to the same criteria. I think that's one way, one approach that we would be adopting.
Thank you. All right. I believe the gentleman in the burgundy shirt had a question. Right.
Good day. Okay. I am Nizam Ali from the Police Academy, the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service. Firstly, let me compliment the Joint Select Committee for organizing the seminar. Mr. Belford gave a very good overview of the sector, followed by Mr. Clamp's experience in the UK. With respect to the UK's experience, I mean, the JSC in soliciting best practices, it's a very good strategic approach. Actually, in 2015, a team from the TTPS, headed by an ACP, visited the UK to look at best practices in police academies. We visited the Metropolitan Police, the Manchester Police Force, the academies, and Scotland. And we got their best practices, and they work closely with the College of Policing that establishes the standards. Now, I'm referring to this because when we come locally and regionally, we are instituting similar institutions and approaches. With respect to Scotland, as Mr. Clamp pointed out, we were impressed with the Scotland's police in terms of their police practices using, well, referring to the College of Policing in the UK, and Scotland, as you know, has its own authority, so they have their policing standards as well. The point is that they refer to the standards being developed by the government bodies. Now, as we come locally, the national security sector, Chairman, must be treated as with all the other sectors that make up the economy, the social and economic sectors. You have the manufacturing sector, you have the financial sector, the education sector, the construction sector. The national security sector should be no different. It's part of the sectoral composition of the country. And with all the other sectors, they are highly regulated. The enterprise, as well as the workforce, they have to be trained, certified, even licensed in some instances. For example, nurses have to be registered and licensed. Plumbers, they have to be licensed by ASA. The electricians have to be licensed by the Government Electrical Inspectorate. At the professional level, it's similar. Engineers have to be registered with the Board of Engineering and so on. So the national security sector should be treated equally. There should be no difference. Now, as we drill down, I'm here to enlighten you on the role and function that the police academy can play. Firstly, let me acknowledge the presence of the police officers here this morning, headed by DCP Dulalchan. Now, the Police Academy is currently awaiting registration status from the Accreditation Council of Trinidad and Tobago. Registration is compulsory, whereas accreditation is optional. So we are just awaiting that registration status. Now, with the registration status of the Police Academy, you have to satisfy a specific standards and criteria, from the organizational structure to the vision, the mission, the programs, and so on. You have to have a quality assurance system. Now, we have worked closely with the National Training Agency in Trinidad and Tobago to develop the occupational standards of policing. And this also extends regionally, whereby you would have regional standards which have been approved by CARICOM for general policing. So these standards will now be used to inform the training programs. Now, the National Training Agency in Trinidad and Tobago has approved the Police Academy to be a workforce assessment center. This is whereby all the family of law enforcement could become trained and certified at a national level. So the Academy is putting that infrastructure in place, similar to the UK approaches. Now, one of the comments earlier was the movement of bodies regionally. Now, there is a section in the CARICOM's, the single market economy, dealing with qualifications. And one of the qualifications is the Caribbean vocational qualification, which is informed by occupational standards. And the CXC and the NTAs in the region are responsible for that qualification. So in Trinidad and Tobago, we are approved by the NTA to offer the CVQs. And this can be extended regionally. So like the CXC, once you have a CXC qualification from Jamaica, it will be recognized and you can move freely through CARICOM. So too with the CVQs in the occupational areas. And to complement that, the CBSI Connect, that's the Caribbean Business Security Initiative, has linked police academies in CARICOM through a distance learning facility. So training can be extended regionally. Just about a month or two ago, there was a regional conference with police academies in the Caribbean and sharing their experiences and so on. So what I'm saying is that we can put some of the systems and policies for training, certification, licensing, and even regulating, well, leading towards regulations, which is a must, and even the badging that Mr. Clamp talks about. So we are putting that infrastructure in place. It just has to be factored into the regulations. Thank you.
Very much. Thank you very much.
Gentleman here also has a question.
Good afternoon, members of the table.
Good afternoon.
My name is John Aboud, and I'm representing ASCOT, the Association of Security Companies of Trinidad and Tobago. I'm also representing myself in my personal capacity as the chairman of Amalgamated Security. First of all, we want to express our appreciation for being invited here this morning to participate in this symposium. And I would really like to focus on the title of the symposium, which is very straightforward and very, how should I put it, macro in concept. The issue of legislation, the industry has been working closely with several governments since the mid-90s on legislation. And I have to say that we came very close many times to arriving at a consensus and to have legislation put in place, only to be disappointed at the 11th hour. So from an industry perspective, we support legislation wholeheartedly for all the reasons Mr. Clamp mentioned and Mr. Fitzgerald Hines mentioned. So we think it will be good for the industry. It will, in fact, resolve many of the woes that we are presently experiencing, whether in underemployment, whether in a lack of training, whether in a lack of... all of those things will go away if we have proper legislation. As an industry, we ask for one thing though, consultation. And when Mr. Hines spoke just now that the 2014 bill is with the AG, I get very frightened because that means after the AG it's going to Parliament. And unfortunately, we never had a look at that 2014 bill. And Minister Hines, notwithstanding what you told my colleague in the EPA, I also look forward to seeing that bill on the website because it's not there. It has to be some secret place.
Let me pause. Let me ask you to hold pause just for a moment to clarify the issue with a bit of a corrective.
Okay.
The 2001 bill was laid in the Parliament.
Oh yeah, oh no, we're talking about 2014 bill.
As well as the regulation.
Right.
The 2014 bill largely resembles, if not identical to, the 2001 bill, and that was published, was made public on the website of the Ministry of National Security. That one, and that was published on the Ministry of National Security's website for public comment. But that one was not laid in the Parliament. That's the corrective.
Okay, well, that,
but in that sense,
I'm relieved now because yes, I thought we were going mad inside
but notwithstanding that corrective, it has been published for public comment. And you just
Minister,
one
you
more.
sure? You
Yes,
sure?
I'm certain about that. In addition to that, even if a bill goes to Parliament, a bill of this nature would typically go to a joint select committee where stakeholders will have an opportunity to appear before that committee to bring to bear their views. This is just another opportunity for us to hear these views before we go to Parliament again.
Okay, well, I'm relieved because I was very involved. All of us on this table was very involved in discussions in 2013 and 2014 on the 2014 bill, which is what my concern was. And suddenly, at a particular stage in the discussions, we were no longer invited, and when we asked to have a review of what was being proposed to make sure that we were comfortable with it, we were blanked. So the concern really is not what you have in the bill, because I'm sure it's going to be fair. The concern is that this industry has been in existence for the better part of 50 years, unregulated essentially, except for the precepted officers that have a fair amount of regulation through the Commissioner of Police. So, but that is the estate constables in terms of the private security are in the extreme minority. Because if you take out in-house security and government in-house security, you find perhaps, I don't know, maybe there are maybe 2,000 or 3,000 precepted officers in the private security, more or less. So the concern is, when this bill comes along, the people, with all due respect to the legislators, who worked on this bill have no idea how the industry operates, what are the peculiarities, what are the issues, and therefore, without getting the feel from the people who are involved in the industry, not only employers, but also employees, we are concerned that things may be in that bill that may be far more difficult to reverse or to modify after, rather than if we had consultation before, it would have been a very easy task based on an explanation put forward to modify. So our concern is legislation, regulation, we support 100%. We beg of you that we must have consultation. The industry employs about 30,000 people. And Minister Dillon, I want to, warn is a very bad word, but I want to alert you that if this bill creates displacement, and I suspect some displacement will be created, you're going to have a much more difficult task on the other side. Because some of these officers, there's a very thin line between being good and being bad. And that's a reality. So we have to make sure that there is some kind of gradual movement from being totally unregulated to being regulated, and once that happens, I think your mission will have been accomplished. I want to congratulate OLIP, because everything that was stated this morning, we have been working with OLIP for a few years on trying to get the industry self-regulated, and we were getting somewhere, and then suddenly we lost a chairman, and the PSNC never met again, and therefore that is just kind of floundering. But the PSNC was one of the ways, because to address the next point, in terms of the relationship or the role private security can place within the national security apparatus, the PSNC, I think we started to do a wonderful job in terms of providing the police, through the PSNC, through OLIP, with intelligence. In fact, all the companies, we had a network of a call-in number where information was being fed to the police, and several crimes and illicit activities were detected as a result of that community between the police, the Ministry of National Security, and private security. As the saying went, we had 30,000 pairs of eyes outside here. So a security officer who's in a warehouse and notices somebody breaking in next door or walking down suspiciously, everyone was being encouraged to call in. Similar kind of program that exists now under different avenues, but the more the merrier. So we want to encourage the Minister of National Security to kind of reactivate PSNC, get it going. It was under his control, it was under the ministry, and it was a way of starting to regulate the industry without regulation and helping the police service in terms of gathering that intel that we so badly need. And to me, these are the two issues that we came to discuss this morning, and I think I've said my piece. Just one question, sir. You said, so security officers in the United Kingdom on armored vehicles don't carry firearms?
No, no weapons at all.
On
armored vehicles as well.
Okay, well, Minister, don't listen to him on that one, eh? Because the bandits will have a field day. Thank you.
Okay, gentleman on that side there. Yeah? Okay, before your question, we have a quick question from Mr. Ramadan.
Yeah, Mr. Abood, in relation to your statement that you were no longer invited, you would appreciate, of course, there comes a time after consultation when action need be taken, and that there had been consultations over many, many years. And you made a statement that is very troublesome, but not necessarily inaccurate, that there may be many persons who are employed in private security who are on the line that could go from police to thief, effectively. And that, I think, brings home the point more than ever, the need for severe and immediate regulation of the industry.
Well, that's why we support the regulation of the industry, and I don't know if the word severe is necessary. I think in the normal course of once you regulate, some people will disappear because they should have never been there in the first place, and many will remain, and there will be an improvement in the lot. So absolutely, and I was in two minds whether to even make that statement in front of our ministers, but we're here in a forum for clarity, and that is a critical thing. I have seen many security officers who worked for me and was dismissed because of dishonesty in a second uniform the following morning, and I look and I laugh. So what was the background done to this on this person? I mean, and I'm not pointing fingers, it happens. And it's because the systems of some companies may not be as robust enough to do these background investigations or to do them on a timely basis so that the person who's out there would have been checked out before he actually goes into a uniform.
Okay, next question.
Mr. Chairman, my name is Derek Smith. I'm the chairman of SESL and a group of companies that work in the upstream and downstream. I support a lot of the comments made by our de facto chairman of ASCOT. We have been working very closely with the government, and albeit sometimes we feel a little left out when the final bill comes on the table. I'd like to suggest that we move away from this oxymoron, which is, I want to read the meaning of it, to make haste slowly. I think the chairman of the JSC alluded to it, that we don't want this thing to stop here. None of us on this table here or anywhere else in this room, even the EPA, wants this thing to stop. But we want to contribute to it, because in Johnny's case, he's a little bit behind me. When I came into the business 40 years ago, there were 7 companies. And out of that 7, we have 25 regulated and 500 unregulated. Thankfully so, mine and Johnny has grown, because we have very high standards. And it is not for lack of wanting to work closely with the government, because I have partnered with even American companies, some of the top companies that bring in solutions right now to this country, and I need the ear of the government, just like anybody else. Being in the business for 40 years is a long time, especially when you have your heart riveted here. So let me make a suggestion. I don't want to come here and talk and pretend I know the business, but I know it's very important for protection of citizens first, business second, and whatever else you want to put in that equation. I'd like to suggest that the Ministry of National Security
as my brother, I think from the EPA talk, or somebody else, the establishment of a statutory body. And that statutory body will have like chairman and maybe sub-chairman of ASCOT, SMART, and all of these different organizations sit on this statutory board to advise the already busy government who is trying to balance their budgets. Let us work with you. One of the things, Mr. Clamp, and may I use a little pun on your name, sir, we're trying to clamp down, really, on the growth of 500 security companies in Trinidad. I see them every day, right? And the clients are getting a little worried, right? Not a little worried, because in some of these companies you have some very bad eggs. As Johnny said, the line between is true. So I think you mentioned somewhere along the line that I took copious notes here, and I just wanted to reflect on what Mr. Clamp said, that, you know, in this industry is a market-driven. And what the clients want from us to protect them and their business is woefully not equivalent to what is put out. So you have a market-driven business, no one to be regulated by the government. No doubt we will have to pay a license fee. It has been toyed around for the last how many years, 25 years. You need to have consultation with us so you get a better appreciation of continuity between different governments that we've been talking to over the last how many years, 25 years. Right? So when we call you, it's not because we want to harass you, we want you to share our knowledge in the industry. So let us form this statutory board and meet with and make it mandatory. At least we meet with the Ministry of National Security. We are a stakeholder, you know. We are outside there. If you hire our 50,000 PIs, according to Johnny, 50 multiplied by 2 is 100,000 eyes, and we will solve crime here. Not 10% and 25% solving of the crime. It will go up. But we must have, you know, Johnny asked the question. I was in Germany and I saw a G4 van parked up by a bank. And when I see them coming out, Johnny, they have no gun. So I asked my German compatriot, I say, so if they try they say, no, you're going to try nothing on that van, my brother. Because the minute you put your hand on the tower, you will see the police just arrive like that, yeah? The camera's working. You understand what I'm saying? The cameras work. Not like Dana Sita Hall. They work. All right, so we have a serious problem here where we are overpowered by guns, Mr. Minister. 38,000 high-powered guns. Go on your fancy phone, and you'll see these fellas. Thankfully, some of them demised by now with 2 AK-47 and 2 down in their pocket here. How could a police on my guard stop that? So we're talking two different cultures here. We cannot clamp down on certain things here. This is a culture. Mr. Clamp has to understand our culture here, and we understand his. English security and American security is totally different. Totally. An American gun will have guns all over him. An Englishman have no guns on him 15 years ago. Please let us form this statutory body after Mr. Aboud. I wanted him to talk first. And let us be represented on that statutory board with legal, finance, all the different ministries. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just before we take those.
Okay.
A question for Mr. Clamp, and let me preface it by saying my statement, my question or comment has no ill intent to the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service, but it's part of the component. A lot of what happened in the UK is predicated on the presumption of an effective, efficient police service. We have our issues and challenges in Trinidad and Tobago with police efficiency, police effectiveness, solvency rates, etc. How, if at all, much did the SIA play a role in, because if we're asking by regulation to standardize and upgrade the services provided by private security services, we must do the same for our police service. And how much did the SAIA play a role in providing feedback and exchange in terms of improving the divisional operations of various police divisions throughout the UK, if at all, and the improvement of police operations?
We obviously have to be very careful in providing feedback to the police in general, but when it comes to the operation of private security businesses and individuals, then we do clearly have a role to play. One of the challenges we've had through this 15, 16 years of regulation is the fact that there are still a number of police officers who are largely unaware of regulation of private security, of what the standards are, of what we do, and of how they can operate with, alongside private security individuals. Those numbers are coming down. I don't think there have been any particular issues other than awareness. I'm aware that there's been some research done fairly recently which asks questions about the police trust in the private security industry, which is much better than it was, but there's still a long way to go. So the dialogue between the police, private security operatives and the SIA continues, but predominantly I think it's very much about working together, and in some areas that works particularly well. Scotland's been mentioned a couple of times, Northern Ireland is another area. Whether it's because they're small with a single police force, I don't know, and maybe that makes it easier, but actually also in London. So with the Metropolitan Police Force there, we do work very closely together. But it is an area where we need to improve. We've got a fairly new initiative called Police and Security, which is talking about joint working and feedback and sharing good practice. Again, that's focused primarily in London at the moment, but we're looking to roll that out. And it's interesting to hear from the Police Academy that there is some thought about training across the board, because in the UK, the College of Policing has only really been established for about 3 years, and it's still got a lot of work to do. And actually, policing and private security have been seen to be very separate. And one of my jobs, certainly over the next 12 to 24 months, is to try to join that up more. But I think your opening remark is that we have to base how much of an impact we have on working with an effective police force. By and large, that does work really well for us, and it's a good starting point.
So we have this gentleman here, and then we'll take gentleman over there. Before our next question, I'd just like to remind our viewing audience that you can submit questions or comments to our email, parl101@ttparliament.org, or on the chat on our YouTube channel, ParlView. Thank you. Go ahead.
Good afternoon. My name is David Brown. I wonder who I'm representing. I'm a Special Reserve Police Officer, and I'm wearing this hat now. I would like to see considered, or if not legislated somewhere in the proposals going forward, some mandatory synergistic relationships between security and the police. Not only at the level, I think Mr. Clamp would have just spoken on what I was going to talk about. In treating with the crime situation in Trinidad and Tobago, I think we have a wider spread with many security officers all over the country that can aid in providing critical information in their communities and in their work environments, in assisting the police in reducing crime. And I feel it shouldn't be that you hope that when you go to the police station, you are assisted by an understanding police officer, because the experience a lot of times is the ordinary security officer may in some instances be chased out of the police station by the police officer. I think we need to put something tighter in there, because if we want to reduce crime significantly, I feel the private security industry has a critical role to play in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Good afternoon, everyone. Members of the head table, distinguished guests and participants. My name is Likoy Tobias. I am the Manager, Security Services for the Eastern Regional Health Authority. So I'm not representing a company. I'm here more or less as a client. My first question to the committee is in relation to something that Dr. Clamp mentioned pertaining rating security firms. And would that be part of the legislation going forward? Why I ask this is because as a client, whenever we are evaluating companies, there isn't a rating really. So I now would have to go on either the lowest price and the ability to meet the scope of works. Now, if there's a rating scheme, I could now say, well, here what? You meet the scope of works, the ability to meet it, your price is within my budgetary allocation, and you have the highest rating. So I don't know if the committee would want to consider that in terms of the legislation. The other thing I would like to mention is Senator Paul Richards mentioned about the transition period. Well, he asked Dr. Clamp about the transition period between when the legislation was passed and I believe presently now. Now, I don't know if the committee would take that into consideration whenever the legislation is passed in terms of having a mandatory time frame or something along that line to actually enforcing or enacting the legislation. Because as Senator Richards mentioned, you may have an existing contract in place, and with the new legislation, I mean, it's a binding agreement, so what do we do? So I don't know if that would be taken into consideration. And the last thing I'd like to mention is the training aspect. Now, a couple of individuals would have mentioned training prior, and I saw it on the bill, so congratulations again to the committee for putting it in. Now, last month, the Ministry of Labor and Small Business Enterprises held a symposium extremely similar to this one. And I would have mentioned through City and Guild, there is actually a accredited training program level 1 and 2 for security officers. For example, the government of Jamaica has actually passed legislation where security officers must be certified trained in order to be a security officer. So I don't know if you all will want to take that into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just to respond to a couple of comments that were made there about the purchasing or the buying of private security, I think they're very valid. I referred to them in my presentation, that when there is a quality standard, you can look for it. When there isn't, what do you do? And it can be difficult, which is why I think even pre-legislation, some of the work that can be done in terms of what sort of questions can you be asking, what should you be looking for, so you can at least provide yourself with some reassurance is useful. And in terms of the phased implementation of regulation, one of the things that did happen when we introduced our quality scheme was that we gave people a heads up in terms of saying these are the standards that are coming in a year's time. And some of the proactive companies took those standards, they worked with them, and they were able to demonstrate to customers that in their view at least, they were already there or mostly there, even before they were independently assessed. So it is something that people can be working on in that space. I have been asked, actually, just as a general response to some of the points that have been made, just to reflect slightly more on our governance structure at the Security Industry Authority, particularly because there have been a couple of comments about consultation and industry representation. So the SIA has a chair who's appointed by the Home Secretary. It also has a board of 6 independent members. They don't represent companies, they don't represent anybody who is regulated, they are independent. They're not even on our payroll, they're paid by central government. And it's very important, in my view, having worked in regulation for a long time, for regulation to be independent. Because sometimes we have to pass judgment and take action that some politicians but for example, some industrialists would not like, and we cannot be seen ever to be influenced in that decision making, which is why an independent board is a very powerful thing. That said, any regulator that operates independently of the sector and doesn't engage and consult with it is going to cause itself a lot of problems. So we have a stakeholder board that meets quarterly, that has representation from industry representative groups, big companies, small companies, and so on. And every 3 months we sit down with them and we say, how are we doing? How are you doing? What are the problems? What are the challenges? How can we work together to put these things in place? And I think only by doing that, not just through legislation, but once the legislation is passed, can you have regulation which genuinely knows what's going on in the sector and doesn't bend its rules or kowtow to any one individual or company, but is aware of the implications of what it does and how to maximize its impact.
Okay. Thank you very much. From the discussions we've had so far, I have gleaned that the vast majority of us want some kind of regulation. Mr. Clamp spoke, however, of a dichotomy in the British experience between self-regulation on the one hand and mandatory, I would call it, regulation on the other. From the discussions I've heard so far and the strong calls for a statutory body, which of course the SIA is, it is established under the law of 2001, so it is a statutory body, and you have just heard how it is structured. A chairman and a 6-member board, independent, not representing the industry, not representing the government, but independent, though appointed by the Home Secretary, and a CEO, and the way they work, he's just explained that. So from what I'm hearing so far, this committee is hearing, it appears as though we have focused on regulation, but not self-regulation, mandatory regulation. And the calls for statutory board says that we need to have something resembling an independent statutory board along the lines of the SIA. That's what I'm gathering so far. If that is not correct, help us, let us know.
We have the gentleman to the center.
Good day to the panel, the members of parliament and members of the Joint Select Committee. My name is Stephen Madison and I represent the Security Owners and Managers Association as their consultant. A lot of what was said here today, for the most part, and according to the Honorable Fitzgerald Hines, the industry would certainly recommend. Regulation is something that is long in coming. It is something that we certainly appreciate at this time. We just hope that at this juncture, it probably is not another talk shop because we've had a lot of that in the past few years. One issue that plagues the industry, by and large, is training. And I want to say that no person in Trinidad and Tobago, probably which is different from the case probably in Jamaica, goes to school and learn to become a security officer. No one graduates from school wanting to become a security officer. And that brings, to a large extent, the kind of problem as it relates to the volatility of the industry. In some cases, some companies that I've represented as a consultant, you find that there are up to 41% in retention in terms of turnover. You have security companies. A few days ago, I was at the head of a training class at a very large company, and I was asking, how many of you have worked with a security company before? And these are persons who 2 days into their training. And in most cases, a lot of them had been to 4 or 5 different security companies before, and that tells us something. What we as SOMA, the security managers and owners association, is going to be recommending, we're going to be putting a position paper that would seek to get CSME recognition, security officers CSME recognition. And that is something that we will be actively working on at this point in time. It is something that we feel that is necessary given the volatility of the market and what could probably emanate from regulation. Because as we say, as all of us would have recommended, that when regulation comes into place, what is going to happen is that a lot of the bad eggs may start falling off the grill of the security officers. Right? That is my contribution at this time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good day, everyone. My name is Jethro John, and I'm the the president of the International Defensive Pistol Association. It was a little bit interesting earlier on to hear the vice chairman ask about the aspect of firearms as per security officers doing their duties. And Mr. Clamp, as it was mentioned earlier on, Trinidad and Tobago is a totally different culture. And it was spoken about before about the high-powered weapons in Trinidad and Tobago and how they affect the security industry. And we are not a private security company, but we are a training organization. And I just wanted to bring home the point that when a regulation takes place, that emphasis is placed on training. We see a lot of people coming to the range, handling firearms. I've been a firearms instructor for the last 20 years. And there's a lot to be spoken about in terms of training and how people handle firearms, safety, and understanding the whole industry. And we just wanted to let you all know that training is available, and it's something that should be seriously taken into consideration in the new regulations to come by. That's my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Okay.
I have one more question. Oh, let the gentleman go ahead.
Okay.
Hi, good day, everybody. My name is Jason Cooper. I am Estate Constable of the CDA, Chaguaramas Development Authority. We do applaud the fact that we are looking forward, and it is overdue for regulations. It has been repeated over and over again here. But it has some things that actually bother me to a certain point, and this is other organizations or programs outside of the private security sector that I think is not being used efficiently enough, or not being used at all, right? Before I start on that, the idea of the security being regulated, that is something that we welcome. The question is, can you use security in the sense of solving crime? And I'm talking about subsidizing. We already have something in the sense of security companies giving government certain services, transportation of prisoners and so on. One of the aspects of crime that has always gotten away from us is the detection rate and so on. And it have certain things, SANS, that can actually prove very worthy within solving crimes. DNA, right? In the sense of DNA testing and whatever the case is it possible, this is the question, is it possible that we can look at security companies who might want to specialize in different segments of crime detection, such as DNA or whatever the case is, to do the work for a price, of course, to detect crime on this level, on a science level, and not just the eyes and the ears that coordinates with the police service and so on. That is one question. In the sense of the social impact, I did mention earlier in which we do not use our programs efficiently. One of them is GATE. It is a very good program in the sense of it educates people And it, when it comes to the population, educated population makes educated decisions, right? One of the things is that I do not think that the people who attend or use GATE in the sense of, and I'm using one of the disciplines in the sense of psychology, right? These people who actually study psychology, they may not have a doctorate or may not even have a master's or even a degree as yet, but they are training to be so.
Follow the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago on Twitter. Our call sign is @TTParliament.
Democracy Redefined, History of the Parliament Channel.
See them exposed to the elements. In fact, I have no doubt
fact bring some level of dignity for our security officers. We will be prepared to make our recommendations in due course. But I want to crave your indulgence and ask the opportunity to say a special thank you for the support that we continue to get as an organization from our security partners. And I have noted here the concerns raised by Mr. Belfort, more so in relation to the way security officers are in fact slighted by our junior police officers. And it's something, whilst we await the structure into this private security company, I will go back trying to see what I can do immediately to ensure that we understand the role of the security and we treat them as partners as we all strive to make Trinidad and Tobago a much safer place. I thank you.
Thank you very much. This is
Thank
commendable.
you. I believe Senator Richards had a question.
Yes,
as well.
quick question to Mr. Clamp. We focus quite a bit on the individual officers, but you indicated in your presentation that quite a bit of emphasis is also placed in the companies and the governance structures in the companies that operate private security companies. In your research and in your operation over the last 15 years, did you find the SA able to provide guidance to help some of these companies, because the small companies will have a greater challenge, I should say, financially and resource-wise, in upgrading to those governance standards that are required to run the operations at those levels?
That's a very good question, because we need to be mindful that we set standards for companies which provide assurance to the general public and to buyers of security that they're getting good quality. Yet at the same time, we don't want to set artificially high standards. Sometimes I use the example of, given we're in one already, of hotels. Perfectly happy to be in a 3 or a 4-star hotel. You can't be a 5-star hotel unless you have a swimming pool or a gym or a business center. But does that actually mean you'll provide better quality service to your customers? So it is something we're mindful of in terms of the requirements of any legislation. Ours is voluntary, but it could be compulsory. And it shouldn't be a barrier to small companies. Furthermore, we've already mentioned a couple of times that there needs to be a phased introduction to regulation so people can get used to the standards and work towards them. But I think in those first, however long it might be, months or even up to a couple of years perhaps, I think one of the roles of the regulator is to function in the area of information, advice and guidance about how to comply with the standards, and at an appropriate level to support companies to achieve those aims. But if you're starting to ask for things for companies to have which do not have a direct impact on the quality of security they provide, then perhaps you are doing a bit of gold plating of your regulation, and it does become a barrier to entry. In the UK, since 2012, I think it is, all regulators have had a statutory duty to bear in mind the need to support business growth. So in every decision that a regulator makes, it needs to say, will this impact on business, particularly small and medium-sized enterprises? Now, ultimately, its regulatory role comes out on top there. So if it adds to public protection, then you'll do it anyway. But you still need to be mindful of it in decision-making. So it is something to consider very carefully when thinking about legislation, the regulations and the rules. And it comes back to that point about consulting, not just with the big firms or the people with the loudest voices, but everybody, to make sure that what you introduce is proportionate, but at the same time, you're never making over allowances for it so that a smaller or less experienced company could provide a lower quality product. You can't compromise on the standards.
If I may just go to the speaker before, Mr. Dulalchan, who raised the issue of being allowed, private security industry being allowed to assist in the detection rate in crime and so on. One would expect that, as I mean, there has been a clarion call by the Commissioner of Police and myself at times, that there is a role for almost every citizen in Trinidad and Tobago to assist in the detection rate by coming forward and presenting the kind of evidence, the kind of support that's required for the police to solve the crime. So we can't take out the private security industry from that at all. In fact, they have a very important role to play. As mentioned a while ago by Mr. Aboud, he said that there's about 20,000 eyes that we can put on the table. And I mentioned again the whole issue of cooperation and collaboration. But you can only do so, one, I believe, by regulating the industry, by having that level playing field, but also by a question of both the private security industry and the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service and other agencies of national security, understanding the professional, developing and understanding the professional nature of the service that you provide. You know, one can use the analogy of the bricklayers, and they use that where this gentleman observed 3 persons laying bricks. When you ask the first one, and they're all doing it differently, when he asked the first gentleman, who was very casual, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well, I'm laying bricks." The second gentleman he asked, which was a little more up-tempo than the other one, "What's the job? What are you doing?" He said, "I'm building a wall." And the third gentleman he asked was very happy and understanding and seemed to have a different kind of mentality. He said, "I'm building a cathedral." Because the third gentleman understands the big picture. And I use that analogy because sometimes in our industries, we place security guards at certain points and we don't let them understand the big picture. How do they contribute? How does the man in front of that store or the man who's guarding some element understand that he's not just guarding there, but he's also playing a role. He also has eyes and ears. He's also looking at the wider security environment. How does he understand that he or she is in fact contributing to the wider security environment? He's not just laying a brick. He's building that cathedral. He's seeing the wider picture. And that can only come by understanding, by a degree of professionalism, but also by the companies in the private security industry understanding their remit and playing a part, an important role in the wider security environment. All right? So that I want you to take on board that everyone can play a part in raising or contributing to the detection of crime in Trinidad and Tobago, and not just the police service. The other question with respect to the privatization of DNA, let me say at this point in time, the government is not in the way of privatizing the whole question of DNA. And we've gone way ahead of the game. The DNA bill was passed sometime around 2015, if my memory serves me well. But we've gone past that. We are now in the process of developing regulations for the DNA. We have hired a DNA custodian. We are now, in fact, procuring the kind of material that's required to start DNA testing. The bill allows us to start with our prison population, and that's where we're going to start. It also allows us to, anyone who is arrested, we can do DNA sampling on them. So that we are about to start that process. We are in the process of procurement right now to treat with DNA and DNA custodian and the DNA database. So I thought I'd just put that on the table in terms of information at this point in time. Thank you.
Okay, we're running out of time, so we'll just take gentleman at the back and gentleman here.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Wayne Williams. I'm representing TSCT, a security buyer. I took note of the last comment Mr. Clamps made in terms of standards, because it's important for us as a buyer to get a quality officer who we can trust with our assets. At the same time, though, the point that you made in terms of balancing entry to the industry and the market needs, it's a challenge, because and how do you guys do it? How do you determine what the standards are going to be? And is it totally based on market needs? How do you do that? Because I have another question, but I'll wait until you answer this one before I go forward.
It's a good question because there's no easy answer. We are scrutinized as a regulator to make sure that what we do is proportionate and doesn't distort the market. Primarily, our role is one of public protection, and we have many debates, including amongst that independent board, about the right path to take. And ultimately, if it's a close call, we go down the line of the regulation and public protection, because ultimately that's what we exist for. Having said that, there will be others across wider government who would challenge back in that space. And ultimately, as if you want a kind of delivery body of the Home Office and therefore of government, it's the central government who would make those big decisions, particularly around changing our legislation. But at local level, there can be a challenge there. So if this was some sort of music event and we're obliged to have 10 security operatives, but we can only find 6 licensed ones, then what do? Do we get 4 other people who could help us out, who may be able to do a reasonable job, and we'd be breaking the law, or do we not? And on occasion, although thankfully quite rarely, we have had to actually say, in terms of particular events, because that's where the critical mass turns up, that we would recommend they don't take place. Ultimately, the decision around things like that tends to rely with the police, but they will take our advice on it. So it's a difficult path to tread. The regulator's role is to do so, to take its action proportionately without affecting the market, but ultimately, if it comes down to a matter of public protection, it's that trumps any business need.
Do you have a high attrition rate in terms of security in the UK? Because we have it here. So as one of these spokespersons, one of the persons made the point that you have officers coming in and out of the industry. So do you have that problem where a security officer, person might be a security officer today, and next 2 weeks he's a lay person or he's a gardener or something like that? And how does the system deal with that?
The nature of the workforce is a challenge. Security is often not a first choice job. It's low paid, it's long hours. As we've heard, sometimes you're on a shift for a long period of time on your own in not particularly positive conditions. Although if that actually was an operative of one of our approved companies, they'd lose their status if they made people work in that space. But it is a challenge. There's little progression in that area. And what we're trying to do now, although strictly speaking, you could argue that it's not our role, but if it leads to higher standards and greater consistency within the industry, perhaps it is to look at things like additional training, higher level training, management training, specialization in certain parts of security, which are more attractive or better paid, such as close protection, although there's a limited market for that. Interestingly, some of the things we've been talking about today, perhaps if it's a pathway into an alternative profession, whereby perhaps by working with the police and doing more training, getting more qualifications, you can ultimately work in the police force. I think somebody mentioned earlier that there's not many people at school who say, I want to be a security officer, but there are a considerable number of people at school, definitely in the UK and hopefully here, who say, I'd quite like to be a police officer, and that's another route into that. And the other area where this may work is actually a career within their business itself, or even for entrepreneurs to start their own business. And my final point would be that everybody, as has been mentioned on this panel and on the floor, is part of the solution to the problem. And one of the things I think is important to try to get across to security guards is that they are performing a role in protecting the public. If I'm standing on a door of a pub or a club, I'm letting the right people in and keeping the wrong people out. But I'm also there if there's an issue that requires first aid. I'm also looking out for vulnerable people in the area. I'm also reporting to the police or through some anonymous reporting system any crimes, suspected crimes. I'm also looking at child sexual exploitation and other vulnerable people. And actually also in the SIA over the last 18 months, we've had a big drive on violence reduction initiatives. And we want people to feel as if they're part of that, because it encourages them to raise their standards as well. But turnover within the sector, pay and terms and conditions is a challenge to that. And we need to work with the industry so that they themselves as well can see how that can be addressed.
Here we'll have our final person.
Good afternoon to the panel and to the floor. I just wanted to...
Could you just give us your name and what body you represent?
Ibn Lama De Leon, Security Owners and Managers Associates of Trinidad and Tobago, also known as SOMAT. The first comment I'd like to make is to the floor. A number of us here might have been placed at a little disadvantage coming to comment on the bill that we would not have seen. Now, a lot of people raise the issues about training and legislation and the regulations and so on. And if I may take the words of Chairman Hines, he indicated that it is very similar to the previous legislation that was laid before. So all those concerns that would have been raised, I think, would have been addressed if there were no fundamental changes in the previous drafts that we would have had before, whether it's the 2011 or 2014 versions of the bill. So I think we should look at that to satisfy ourselves that most of our concerns would have been addressed already unless there was some sort of tweaking that we could comment on after. Another thing in the industry today is we do have a very strong presence of non-nationals operating in the industry. Some of them operate within the CSME, many of them may not come from within the CSME. So while we look at trying to get them included in the CSME family, maybe it might be good for the authorities to consider some sort of empathy with respect to security companies trying to access work permits for non-nationals, because there's a very big problem outside there. We have heard comments from various speakers about training, the relationship with the public, the relationship with other police officers and so on, the members of the police service. I'm saying that there has the existence of the industry in Trinidad and Tobago is there because there is a gap or a void between the expectations of the citizens and the deliverables of the TTPS. It has been there since the inception of the industry. Over time, we have been summoned by the TTPS to assist in various things over the years. And as I said before, incidents of 1970, 1990, and 9/11 have shaped and framed and forged the way forward for the industry. But there are two things we can point to show the collaboration between the industry and the state. We have Justice on Time, done by Amalgamated. We had the Community Comfort Patrol. We all know the Community Comfort Patrol, the services were terminated. But with the termination of the CCP, there was a hue and cry coming from the public for the first time that I am aware, where the general public was praising security officers. Now, those security officers were under the remit of the PSNC, who was responsible for the training and everything that goes with it. So I'm saying we need to look at the PSNC because while we wait on the legislation, there may be low-hanging fruit that we can address. We spoke about, there was recently a stakeholders meeting by the Ministry of Labor, now there's this one, and one of the common denominators that we don't know how many security companies there are in Trinidad. So while we are looking to push the legislation, which we will support, there may be low-hanging fruit that we can address. One is the reactivation of the PSNC, which is now dormant because we need a chairman, and we can, as far as is humanly possible, get the security companies operating in Trinidad and Tobago to register with the PSNC. So at least we start to develop some form of database with respect to companies, staffing, and so on. The PSNC was also responsible for the interagency relationship between the private security industry and the various arms, whether it was the ODPM, the TTPS, whatever the case might be. So that is already there. I'm saying that once we look at the relationship that the PSNC had with the industry in the absence of the regulation, trying to bring some sort of sanity and merger between the entities, I'm saying that that might be a good first step towards trying to get some work done in the interim while we work on the legislation. That's my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you. At this time, we would like to re-invite the chairman of the Joint Select Committee on National Security back to the podium, where he will give some closing remarks. Mr. Hines.
Thank you very much, Atiba. I assure you that in the way of King Henry VIII, as he related to his many wives, I would not keep you very long. We have come to the end of what I consider to be a great day, a very successful day. Not totally successful, because total success will be determined with what we do with the information and the energy that this day generated. But a great day notwithstanding, we were able to sit together, all as citizens of this republic, holding various offices And we were able to deliberate upon a matter that is obviously very important to all of us, and from the tone of the discussions, urgent as well. And I thank God for that. All of your comments, all of your concerns, all of your observations have been recorded and will be treated respectfully and seriously. From that which I learned today, and I learned much myself, a lot of these deliberations would have taken place before. So we are not starting from ground zero. However, what was different today is that we brought an industry expert from from the United Kingdom, who leads a statutory body that regulates the private security industry in that space. And his intervention today would have given us some new ideas and some new insights and some new approaches for our consideration. In which case, I would like to suggest that those of you who did not for any reason speak to us today and whose thoughts were not represented in those who, or through those who spoke, we of this Joint Select Committee would be more than happy to receive your thoughts, your concerns, your comments by way of email, and I would like for the record to state this email address: JSC, as in Joint Select Committee, JSC, National Security, at ttparliament.org. JSC National Security at ttparliament.org. And we, in demonstration of our own commitment to getting on with it, ask you to make your submissions within 2 weeks. That is to say, by the 27th of September 2017. You may have made submissions before, but the intervention of Mr. Clamp may yield fresh suggestions, and we look forward to those. It falls, therefore, to me as chairman of this committee to express our thanks. And when I say our, I mean the people of Trinidad and Tobago on this occasion. First of all, I would like to thank the Honorable Major General Edmund Dillon, the Minister of National Security, for accepting our invitation to be here and providing us through OLEP with the fact patterns as they did and your synopsis of those in your presentation. We would like to thank the Minister of National Security. This is not to be self-serving, but I'd like to thank my other colleagues on this Joint Select Committee, all present at the head table and those who are among us in the audience. Thank you all very much as well. Must as well thank the clerks of both houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate of the Parliament of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, for your very focused work in making so much at the level of this committee happen, including the organization and this symposium here today. I'd like to thank them. And as well, the committee's secretariat and the staff of the Parliament generally for all of your very acutely professional interventions. I always say, one of the most professional outfits I've had the pleasure of working with over my many years. Thank you all very much. Mr. Curtis Belfon and the representatives of the Ministry of National Security, particularly, I would like to thank you for your presentation today. It was illuminating and it has advanced our thoughts and approaches to resolutions substantially. Thank you very much. I would like to say, for very, very many reasons, a special thanks to the representatives of the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service here today. This one touches home because I was born in the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service, as you well know. And I would like to specially thank you to have the presence for all of these hours, a deputy commissioner and other senior ranks of the service, away from what we ask them to do for us out there, is really, we must be thankful. Let us recognize their presence. And we would have understood better today if we didn't before that they play a very key role. In fact, they are the main security outfit in this country and play a key role in any developments around the private security industry. And I must more specifically thank Mr. Dulal Chan, who took the mic today and told us, or reflected to us, that notwithstanding the tools of what we use to do our work, and notwithstanding the legislative framework that we are approaching, the key issue is one of attitude. And Mr. Dulal Chan's intervention today suggested that he is going to do all that he could to ensure that the police service, big and important as it is, demonstrates the right attitudes and mindsets as it relates to the private security sector, to ensure that this thing becomes real, and I would like to thank you for that. Representatives of my ministry, the Ministry of the Attorney General and Legal Affairs, we thank you for your presence and your work, including the Chief Parliamentary Counsel, who has been paying close attention to these deliberations, because at the end of the day, it is their responsibility to put our ideas into what we call legalese. So we thank you for your observations and the corrective that I was able to place in relation to whether both bills were laid in the Parliament came from I was about to say lips. I must reject that. I was about to say pen. I must also reject that. I say fingers by way of a text message from the Chief Parliamentary Counsel. So thank you. Representatives, President and representatives of the Association of Security Companies of Trinidad and Tobago, and the President and representatives of the Security Owners and Managers Association of Trinidad and Tobago, your contributions today, as we gather, you have been making over the past few years, was really, really deeply appreciated, and it will guide us along the way because you are the key stakeholders and your intervention was timely and necessary, and we would like to compliment and thank you for that. The President and representatives of the Estate Police Association, we thank you very much for your work, your contribution, representing a subset of the private security industry as distinct from the police and other arms of the national or state security apparatus. We thank you for your work, and your comments and observations have been noted. We are not unaware that you have problems, and we hope that we will assist in addressing them going forward. We thank you for your presence and your intervention today. Generally all industry stakeholders, members of the public, both present and those who would be looking on via the technological means that are available for that. We would like to thank you for your participation in that way, and we appreciate your intervention. Members of the media, we thank you for your presence, because it is by your presence the world will get to know that which we deliberated on today and the direction that Trinidad and Tobago must go in the future. I just received a note as though I forgot. I did not. I am a strict vegetarian, but I still practice the old adage that you leave the best or you leave the meat for last. I therefore would like, thanking you for the reminder, I would like to really ask you to join us in celebrating and thanking Mr. Alan Clamp, the Chief Executive Officer of the Private Security Authority of the United Kingdom. In his usual British and stoic way, he stood before us this morning and he told us what the problems they experienced were, the manner in which they approached it, the sober manner in which they approached it, its manifestation in legislation, the establishment of a statutory body with a governance structure, and we will be looking closely at that. So, Mr. Clamp, On my own behalf, and on behalf of all of us present in this room, looking on at these proceedings, and all Trinidad and Tobago, we would like to thank you for the time and trouble you took to visit with us to do the work you have done. Thanks again. And I received another note. This one is a genuine reminder, and I accept it for that. It is to thank the managers, the owners and managers of this wonderful edifice, the Hyatt Regency Hotel, for your hospitality, for your entertaining us. We had planned to keep this symposium in the precincts of the Parliament, but of course, because you attended so loftily, it was oversubscribed, and belatedly we decided to come here. The Hyatt Regency Hotel accommodated us, and let us thank them for their support and encouragement. And if I did not say it expressly, I must have implied it, but if I did not say it expressly, I would like, on your behalf, to thank God for our very existence, and for this symposium, and for the work that must follow to make it real for the people of Trinidad and Tobago. Thank God. Thank you all. God bless Trinidad and Tobago. Return safely to your workplaces. I didn't say home. Return safely to your workplaces and continue to get the job done. God bless you all. Thank you.